The torpedo had already hit. Fire rolled out of the cargo ship's holds, black smoke climbing into the night as men scrambled across the deck. Lifeboats were being lowered. Some were already in the water. From a distance, it looked like another easy kill, another merchant ship dying quietly off the American coast. Then, the submarine surfaced. Just a few hundred yards away, its dark hull rising out of the Atlantic, its crew moving into position to finish the job with gunfire. The German commander had seen this scene dozens of times before. A helpless ship, a frightened crew, no resistance. That was when steel panels slammed open along the cargo ship's deck. Hidden guns swung out into the open, barrels leveled, muzzles flashed. The merchant ship erupted with gunfire at point-blank range. For a few stunned seconds, the hunter was the one being hunted. By the end of the night, every man aboard that American ship would be dead, and almost no one would ever know why. 2. The winter of 1942, the United States was losing the Battle of the Atlantic, badly. German submarines prowled the eastern seaboard almost unchallenged. They sank tankers, freighters, and passenger ships within sight of American beaches. Oil slicks drifted ashore. Wreckage washed up on sand, normally crowded with tourists. At night, burning ships lit the horizon. American coastal cities refused to black out. Navigation lights stayed on. Ships sailed alone, fully illuminated, following predictable routes. For German U-boat commanders, it was target practice. The submariners called it the second happy time. Between January and March of 1942, more than 100 Allied ships were sunk in American waters. Hundreds of thousands of tons of fuel, food, weapons, and raw materials disappeared beneath the Atlantic. Thousands of merchant sailors were killed. The United States Navy was not ready. Most destroyers were tied up escorting convoys in the North Atlantic. Patrol aircraft were scarce. Radar coverage was incomplete. Convoy systems along the American coast barely existed. Submarines slipped in and out almost at will. Every sinking increased the pressure in Washington. Something had to be done, and it had to be done quickly. In January 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt floated a desperate idea. What if the Navy revived an old tactic, one that had worked, at least occasionally, in the First World War? Q ships, merchant vessels disguised as helpless prey, secretly armed and designed to lure submarines to the surface, where they could be destroyed at close range. Admiral Ernest King, commander-in-chief of the U.S. fleet, had serious doubts. The tactic was outdated. German submariners were far more experienced than their predecessors in 1917. But the losses were mounting, and the pressure to act was relentless. King moved forward. The program was given a bland name, Project LQ, and buried in secrecy. 5 civilian ships were quietly converted. At Portsmouth Navy Yard in Maine, no press releases, no public announcements, no paper trail in standard Navy files. Money came from emergency funds, bypassing normal oversight. Written records were locked away under the direct control of the Chief of Naval Operations. Even within the Navy, only a handful of officers knew the program existed. These ships would sail alone through known U-boat hunting grounds, posing as easy targets. If a submarine surfaced, the trap would spring. On paper, it sounded clever. In reality, it was a gamble. One of those ships was USS Atik. She was never meant to be a warship. Built in 1912, Atik was a slow, aging cargo steamer, single screw, steam-powered, with a top speed barely reaching 9 knots. She had no armor, no protection, no ability to outrun anything hunting her. What she did have were secrets. 4 4-inch naval guns were hidden behind steel panels designed to fall away in seconds. Machine guns were concealed behind false deck structures. Depth charges were disguised as cargo equipment. Her holds were packed with pulpwood, meant to keep her afloat even after a torpedo hit. To the outside world, she was a neutral merchant vessel, sailing alone under false registration. To her crew, she was a floating trap. Her commanding officer was Lieutenant Commander Harry Linwood Hicks, a career Navy man, trained in gunnery and tactics, calm, professional, and realistic about the mission he had been given. Hicks knew the history of Q ships. He knew their success in the First World War had been limited. He knew German submarine commanders had studied those tactics carefully. He knew Atik was slow, lightly armed, and dangerously exposed. He also knew that 4 previous Q-ship patrols had produced nothing. No kills, no deterrence. Still, Hicks trained his crew as best he could. They practiced dropping panels, manning guns, and waiting, holding fire until the very last possible moment. Most of the men aboard were young. Some were barely out of their teens. Few had ever seen combat. On March 23, 1942, Atik slipped away from Portsmouth and headed south. She sailed alone. The man commanding the submarine that night was not reckless. Captain Lieutenant Reinhard Hartigan was 29 years old in the spring of 1942, already one of Germany's most successful U-boat commanders. He was calm, methodical, and experienced, the kind of officer who survived long enough to learn what mistakes got men killed. Hartigan had not begun his career beneath the sea. He had originally trained as a naval aviator until a crash ended his flying days and pushed him into the submarine service. By the time the war began, he had found his place. In May 1941, he took command of U-123. Within months, he had proven himself dangerous. When Germany launched Operation Drumbeat, Hartigan was among the first sent across the Atlantic. His submarine slipped through American defenses that barely existed. The coastline was lit like a carnival. Ships sailed alone. Harbors glowed behind them. It was almost unbelievable. On his first patrol, Hartigan sank ship after ship, tankers, freighters, unescorted merchants, often without ever being challenged. He later wrote that the Americans seemed unaware they were at war. The ease of it disturbed even seasoned submariners. By March 1942, Hartigan was back again. U-123 prowled the waters off the American coast, conserving torpedoes whenever possible. German doctrine was clear. Torpedoes were precious. A slow, defenseless cargo ship was not worth wasting one if it could be sunk with the deck gun. Hartigan followed orders, but he was no fool. He knew about Q-ships. German intelligence had warned commanders to be cautious, merchant ships that behaved oddly, crews that seemed too disciplined, vessels sailing alone where convoys should have been. When in doubt, attack from distance. Do not surface unnecessarily. Still, the ocean was full of easy targets, and most of them really were helpless. On the evening of March 26th, U-123's lookout spotted smoke on the horizon. Hartigan raised his binoculars and studied the silhouette. A single funnel, slow speed, no escort, no visible armament, an old cargo steamer, exactly the kind of ship he had sunk many times before. Hartigan ordered his submarine to shadow the target, staying submerged, watching patiently as darkness settled in. There was no urgency, no sign of danger, no reason to suspect anything unusual. It looked like another routine kill, and that assumption would bring his submarine closer to destruction than it had ever been before. As night closed in on March 26, 1942, the distance between hunter and target slowly vanished. From beneath the surface, U-123 tracked the cargo ship's course with quiet precision. The sea was moderate, the sky overcast, visibility poor, perfect conditions for an attack. The ship ahead showed no signs of awareness, no course changes, no sudden bursts of speed, just a steady plume of smoke drifting into the dark. Hartigan watched for hours. He waited for the right angle, the right moment. There was no need to rush. The ship was slow. Escape was impossible. The only question was how to finish it. Shortly before 8 in the evening, Hartigan made his decision. U-123 moved into position. The firing solution was clean, range closed, the order was given. A single torpedo streaked through the water. Seconds later, it struck the cargo ship on the port side, just beneath the bridge. The explosion tore into the hull with brutal force. Flames burst upward, steel plates buckled, the ship lurched and began to list. From the submarine's periscope, the scene looked familiar. Men poured onto the deck, some ran, others froze. A lifeboat was lowered on the starboard side. Smoke thickened. Fire spread through the superstructure. There were no return shots, no signal lights, no visible weapons. It looked exactly like what it was supposed to look like. A helpless merchant ship, mortally wounded, its crew abandoning her in the dark. Hartigan ordered U-123 to maneuver around the stern. He intended to surface, finish the job with gunfire, and move on. It was efficient. It conserved torpedoes. It was routine. Nothing in those first minutes suggested danger. Nothing hinted that the ship burning ahead was anything other than another victim. And as U-123 rose toward the surface, Hartigan had every reason to believe the fight was already over. U-123 broke the surface less than 1,000 yards from the burning ship. Diesel engines roared to life as the submarine rose, its dark hull cutting through the waves. On the bridge, German sailors moved into position, preparing to finish the crippled freighter with deck gun fire. It was a familiar moment, close, controlled, almost procedural. Hartigan stepped up, scanning the target through the smoke. The cargo ship was still afloat, still burning. Lifeboats bobbed in the water, men could be seen on deck, silhouetted by flames. Everything about the scene confirmed what he expected to see. Then, the ship changed. Steel panels along the freighter's deck suddenly dropped away. Not slowly, not hesitantly. They crashed open with mechanical force, slamming down like doors blown off their hinges. Gun barrels swung into view. For a split second, there was silence, the kind that exists only when the mind refuses to accept what the eyes are seeing. Then, USS Atik opened fire. A 4-inch naval gun thundered, its muzzle flash lighting up the night. The first shell slammed into the water short of the submarine, throwing up a towering column of spray. A second shot followed almost immediately, missing wide but close enough to send shockwaves through U-123's hull. Machine guns erupted from the ship's superstructure, stitching the water and steel with tracer fire. On the bridge of U-123, men dove for cover. Bullets cracked against the conning tower. One round struck a sailor standing watch, tearing into his chest and dropping him where he stood. Shouts filled the bridge. Orders overlapped. The deck gun crew never got a shot off. Hartigan reacted instantly. Full throttle. Emergency dive. Black smoke poured from the submarine's exhaust as the diesels screamed. U-123 surged forward, turning hard as Atik's guns continued to fire. Another 4-inch shell roared overhead, missing by yards. The next splashed close enough to rock the boat. For a few terrifying seconds, the submarine was trapped, exposed on the surface under direct fire with no room for mistakes. Then the bow dipped. Water rushed over the deck. The bridge disappeared beneath the waves. U-123 slid under, the sounds of gunfire replaced by the deep muffled roar of the sea. Inside the submarine, damage reports came in. The hull was intact. Systems were holding. One man was dying, but the boat had survived. Hartigan stood in the control room, breathing steadily, forcing his mind back into order. He understood what had just happened. He had violated standing orders. He had surfaced too close. He had trusted appearances. He had assumed the ship was helpless, and he had nearly lost his submarine because of it. Above him, USS Atik still burned. Damaged, wounded, but very much alive. The trap had worked. It just hadn't worked long enough. Beneath the surface, U-123 circled back. The shock of the ambush faded quickly, replaced by something colder and more dangerous. Focus. Hartigan knew he had come within seconds of disaster, but he also knew something else. The enemy ship was damaged. The first torpedo had done its work. Atik was burning. She was slow. She was alone. And now, after revealing her guns, she could no longer pretend to be anything but what she was, a wounded warship. Hartigan brought his submarine around underwater, keeping his distance, watching through the periscope as the cargo ship drifted, still stubbornly afloat. Flames licked at the superstructure. Smoke poured into the night sky. The ship's propeller turned weakly, then slowed. The moment of hesitation passed. Hartigan ordered a second attack. At 9:29 p.m., U-123 fired again. The torpedo struck deeper this time, directly into Atik's engine room. The explosion ripped through the ship's heart. Boilers burst. Steam screamed through shattered compartments. Power failed. The single propeller stopped turning. USS Atik was dead in the water. On deck, the reality was immediate and unmistakable. There would be no escape, no maneuvering, no second chance. Orders were given to abandon ship, not as part of a deception this time, but because there was nothing left to fight with. Lifeboats were lowered into the darkness. Men climbed down ropes. Others jumped, disappearing into the black Atlantic below. From beneath the waves, Hartigan watched until he was certain the ship could no longer threaten him. Then he pulled away, conserving what remained of his ammunition, waiting. Above him, the burning hull of USS Atik drifted helplessly, refusing to sink. For the men in the water, the worst was still to come. USS Atik did not sink right away. Despite the torpedo damage, despite the fire tearing through her interior, the ship remained afloat. The pulpwood packed into her holds, meant to give her one last chance to fight, kept her stubbornly buoyant. Her bow settled low. Her stern rose slightly. Flames flickered through shattered bulkheads. In the water around her, lifeboats drifted in loose formation. Men clung to ropes, to wreckage, to anything that would keep them above the waves. Some were burned, others were wounded. All of them were exposed. The night grew worse. The wind strengthened. Waves began to build. Cold Atlantic spray soaked the men in the water, dragging heat from their bodies minute by minute. The glow from the burning ship was the only light left. Shortly before 11 o'clock, something deep inside Atik detonated. The explosion was enormous. A blinding flash tore through the hull, followed by a thunderous roar that echoed across the sea. Steel plates were hurled into the air. Debris rained down over the water. For an instant, the night sky was lit as bright as day. Then, the ship was gone. Where USS Atik had been, there was only wreckage, fire on the surface, and oil spreading across the waves. The blast extinguished any remaining hope. Anyone who had survived the torpedoes and fire was now scattered across a growing storm. Within minutes, the weather turned violent. Wind howled across the water. Waves climbed higher. Lifeboats were blown apart or carried away into darkness. Men were separated, swallowed by the sea one by one. There was no shelter, no rescue nearby, no chance to regroup. From a distance, U-123 watched briefly as the burning debris faded into the storm. One German sailor had been killed during the gunfire. One. On the American side, 141 men vanished into the Atlantic. By morning, there would be nothing left to find. Not bodies, not wreckage, not answers. The first search aircraft arrived the next morning. An Army bomber flew a slow grid over the area where USS Atik was last reported, scanning the gray Atlantic below. For hours, the crew searched for wreckage, lifeboats, survivors, any sign that someone had lived through the night. They found nothing. The storm had erased everything. Waves scattered debris across miles of ocean. Whitecaps masked oil slicks. Broken planks and personal effects, if they existed at all, were impossible to distinguish from the sea itself. Later, a destroyer reached the area and continued the search. It found fragments of wood, a cork float, pieces that could have come from any of the dozens of ships sunk along the coast that winter. There were no bodies, no survivors, no definitive proof of what had happened. 4. The U.S. Navy. The loss was deeply unsettling and deeply embarrassing. USS Atik was classified. Her mission was secret. Officially, she did not exist. There would be no press release, no public acknowledgement. Families would receive brief telegrams, missing in action, lost at sea. No explanation, no details. While the Americans searched blindly, the Germans already knew the truth. On April 9, 1942, German radio announced that a disguised American Q-ship had been sunk after a surface engagement. The broadcast made it clear the deception had been recognized, the trap exposed. German intelligence had been tracking the program. U-boat commanders had been warned. Suspicious merchant ships sailing alone were no longer assumed to be harmless. The element of surprise, the only real advantage Project LQ possessed, was gone. Within the Navy, the implications were immediate and grim. USS Atik had been destroyed on her very first patrol. Every man aboard had been lost, and the enemy had learned exactly what the United States was trying to do. The program designed to stop the slaughter had instead handed the Germans a lesson and paid for it in blood. What came next would not be public, but it would be decisive. When word of Atik's loss reached Washington, Admiral Ernest King ordered an immediate review. The findings were blunt. The Q-ship concept was fundamentally flawed. The ships were too slow to control an engagement, too lightly armed to survive one, and too vulnerable to modern torpedoes. Their crews had been rushed through training. Their supporting forces were positioned too far away to intervene when things went wrong. Most damning of all, the doctrine itself no longer fit the war being fought. German submarines were not the fragile, surface-dependent boats of the First World War. They were faster, better trained, and commanded by officers who understood deception as well as the Allies did. They knew the signs, they knew the risks, and they knew when they suspected a trap, they attacked from distance and vanished beneath the waves. USS Atik had come close to proving the concept could still work. She had damaged a U-boat. She had killed a German sailor. For a few seconds, she had nearly changed the outcome, but one damaged submarine was not worth 141 lives. Project LQ had consumed 5 ships, hundreds of sailors, and precious time. It had produced no confirmed kills. Its only clear result was the total loss of an American crew on their first mission. King's decision was swift. All Q-ship patrols were suspended, the remaining vessels were reassigned or quietly decommissioned. The program was never publicly defended, never openly discussed, and never repeated. Officially, Project LQ faded away. Unofficially, it became a lesson, written not in reports or press releases, but in the absence of survivors, and in the silence that followed. The answer to the U-boat crisis did not come from deception, it came from systems. By the summer of 1942, the United States Navy began to do what it should have done from the beginning. Merchant ships were organized into convoys, not occasionally, not experimentally. But as standard practice, ships stopped sailing alone, routes became unpredictable, escorts became constant, air patrols expanded steadily out from the coast, long-range aircraft closed the gaps where submarines once operated freely. Radar improved, sonar improved, submarines were detected before they could attack, not after. New ships entered service, destroyer escorts built specifically for anti-submarine warfare. They were slower than fleet destroyers, but they were cheaper, numerous, and relentless. They hunted in groups, sharing contacts, maintaining pressure hour after hour. Depth charges became more effective. New weapons allowed escorts to attack submarines without losing contact. Training improved. Crews learned how submarines behaved, how they thought, how they escaped, and how to kill them. None of it was dramatic. There were no clever tricks, no baited traps, no disguises, just organization, technology, repetition. Month by month, the balance shifted. U-boat losses rose, patrols grew shorter, confidence faded. The easy victories of early 1942 disappeared, replaced by constant danger. The Battle of the Atlantic was not won by a single idea. It was won by doing the hard, unglamorous work, and doing it better than the enemy could. For the families of USS Atik, there was no explanation. Telegram after telegram arrived across the country with the same few words: missing in action, lost at sea. No details, no circumstances, no confirmation of death. The ship's mission was classified. Even its existence was secret. For more than 2 years, families waited. Official death notices were not issued until 1944. By then, the war had moved on. New battles filled the headlines. New losses replaced the old. The men of Atik had vanished without ceremony, without graves, without public acknowledgement. 141 sailors died that night. Officers, engineers, gunners, deckhands. Most were in their 20s, some were teenagers. They came from farms, factories, coastal towns, and inland cities. They had trained for weeks, not years, and were sent to sea in a ship that had never truly been ready. Lieutenant Commander Harry Linwood Hicks was never found. Neither was anyone else from his crew. Their names were eventually carved into memorial walls among the missing. Stone replaced bodies. Silence replaced answers. USS Atik herself was never recovered. Her wreck lies somewhere off the American coast, location unknown, unmarked, forgotten beneath the Atlantic. The men aboard did everything they were asked to do. They sailed when ordered. They fought when it mattered. They came within seconds of victory. What failed them was not courage. It was judgment, and the cost of that judgment was paid in lives that history almost forgot.